very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How are you today? Fine, good, excellent. We are sailing the Suez Canal, so if you haven't enjoyed some of it already, I'm sure you will a little bit later on. Fantastic day, the sun is shining. Looks a bit busy out there, lots of ships passing by and everything, so do enjoy the views and everything that's going on a bit later on. But we have a fantastic enrichment lecture this morning. Bob has been with Azamara a few times before, and he has some wonderful lectures over the up-and-coming sea days. If you do miss them, you can catch them on Channel 17. They are repeated from our cameras. They're shown on Channel 17. So he's talking about famous cases. Lots of famous names you will recognize will be coming up over the next few days. But first of all, it is the life and death of Michael Jackson. So please welcome Mr. Bob Schirn. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd just like to give you a little bit more about my background. I've been with the LA County District Attorney's Office since 1967, the summer of '67, so I've been associated with them for 45 years. I retired full-time about 7 years ago, but I've been working part-time for the office for the past 7 years, and I've always considered myself an amateur historian for the office, because during the time that I've been in the DA's office for the last 45 years, it's really amazing how many famous cases have been handled by the LA County DA's office. And one of the benefits of having been in the office as long as I have been is that I've been allowed access to some of the old files, which are some under lock and key, some hidden in archives in the basement, but they let me go down there once in a while. I can't take anything, but at least they let me make copies of some of the materials that I'm able to use in my presentations. And if you come tomorrow for Marilyn Monroe, you'll see that I was able to obtain some materials on her life, which really are not known or available to members of the public. But today's presentation is on Michael Jackson. And this is a trial involving his death that took place only 3 years ago in 2009. So this is a case I'm sure that you're all familiar with. And I think you can make a strong argument that Michael Jackson may have been the outstanding male entertainer of all time. And this slide just sort of shows part of his legacy. He has the #1 selling album of all time, Thriller, with over 100 million copies. 100 million copies sold worldwide. And he's won more Grammys than anyone else. I think the most amazing bit of information on this slide is that he has sold worldwide 750 million copies of his records. To show you how popular Michael Jackson is, I'm a football fan, and in 1993, when Michael was at the top of his popularity, he was the halftime show of the Super Bowl that year, and that's the only year that the halftime show had greater ratings than the football game itself. So I'm just going to talk first about Michael's early life. He was one of 9 children born to Joseph and Catherine Jackson. He was the 7th of the 9 children. He had 5 brothers and 3 sisters. Slide shows the brothers and sisters and who they are. Jermaine was missing from this picture. And just an overview of Michael's life. He was married twice, had 3 children, and he died at age 50 on June 25th, 2009. His father was Joe Jackson. He's still alive, 83 years old. Mother was Catherine Jackson. She's still alive also, and she has custody of Michael's 3 children. Michael's parents were married in 1929. 1949. Actually, I think, it is 1949. And Joseph worked as a crane operator in a steel mill, but he was very interested in music, and he was a member of the Falcons, a 5-man rhythm and blues band that played at various venues, although they were not successful enough to really continue, and they wound up disbanding. Catherine was also interested in music, and she gave her interest in music to her children. She was a devout Jehovah's Witness, and Michael Jackson, for a while, was very much interested in that religion. This is where they lived, in Gary, Indiana, a small home with only 2 bedrooms. Catherine and Joseph slept in one bedroom. The sons slept in the other bedroom using a triple bunk bed, and the girls slept in the living room on a convertible sofa. Father Joseph thought that his sons had some musical talent, and he had his 3 oldest sons, which did not include Michael Jackson at the time, form a group called the Jackson Brothers. And the 3 brothers rehearsed, went to some venues, and when Michael and Marlon, the 6th and 7th children born, got to be about 6 and 7 years old, they joined the 3 older brothers, and they became the Jackson 5 in 1964. Michael was just short of his 6th birthday when he became the 5th and youngest member of the Jackson 5 in 1964. They played in various venues and entered various competitions. This is a newspaper clipping showing that they had come in first place in a local talent competition. And the father, Joseph, was able to get them to release a record which went nowhere, but it was their first record that they made as the Jackson 5. And they were popular enough that Berry Gordy, who was the head of Motown Records in Detroit, near Gary, Indiana, where the boys were living and practicing, heard about them and decided that maybe he wanted to have them join his group of singers at Motown Records. And at that time, he was collecting just a tremendous stable of singing artists, including the Supremes, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Temptations, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder. And he wound up listening to a tape that the boys had prepared, and they came under contract to Motown Records in July 1968. The contracts that Berry Gordy had the people who worked for him sign were very controlling. The artists that worked for Motown really had very little control over the types of songs they would sing. They could not write any of their own songs. They basically were under the complete control of Berry Gordy and Motown Records. So remember that they signed their contract in July 1968. About a year later, the boys had been in the studio a lot, but Berry Gordy had not released any of their records. But Berry Gordy does move to Hollywood during this time because he wants to take advantage of some of the opportunities to make movies in Hollywood. So Motown Records moves from Detroit headquarters to Hollywood as their headquarters. Michael Jackson and his brothers also moved to Hollywood, and before they get settled, Michael is able to live in the home of Diana Ross before the family actually has an actual residence in Los Angeles, and that began a long friendship that Michael had with Diana Ross. It was over a year before Berry Gordy felt comfortable enough to release one of the Jackson 5's records. Pointed out that they signed their contract in July 1968. It wasn't until October of 1969 that Berry Gordy finally decided to release one of their records. And sure enough, the record jumps to the top of the charts, becomes the #1 song in the United States. So quickly they release another Jackson 5 song that also reaches #1. So for the next few months, additional songs are released, 4 altogether, and the first 4 songs released that were made by the Jackson 5 all reached #1 on the charts in the United States. And that is something that was unprecedented for a new group to have their first 4 records all reach #1 on the charts. The 5th and 6th records that were released by the Jackson 5 didn't do quite as well. They just reached #2 on the charts. But when you think about it, that's pretty amazing. The first 6 records released by this group of young singers are 4 number 1 hits and 2 that reached number 2 on the charts. And the popularity, of course, is reflected by certain appearances that the Jackson 5 make. You may remember the Ed Sullivan Show. He used to book all of the best acts to appear on his program. The Beatles were probably the most popular group that he was able to get on his show, but the Jackson 5 also appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show and had a very successful appearance on that program. There was a lot of money to be made going on tours, and the Jackson 5 went on tours. Here they are at Heathrow Airport in London while they're on tour. Michael Jackson, although he was the youngest member of the group, he became almost immediately the lead singer for the group because he clearly was the most talented of the members of the Jackson 5 with his other 4 brothers. Here they make the cover of Life magazine, the parents and the members of the Jackson 5 at their home. They're also able to purchase a beautiful estate in Encino, California, and here's a picture of them at their Encino, California home. Joseph Jackson, the father, was frustrated by Motown because of the control that Motown exercised over his 5 kids. And also the money they made from Motown wasn't really what he thought they should be making. So he was able to eventually move away from Motown and sign a new contract for his 5 sons with Epic Records. One of the problems was that Motown had the rights to the name Jackson 5, so they had to change their names to the Jacksons, but at least now they had the ability to select the records they wanted to sing. Michael Jackson liked to write songs, and he was now able to actually write some of the songs that were going to be sung by the members of the now called Jacksons. So for the next 8 years or so, remember Michael was born in 1958, so from age 18 to about 26 years old, he does a lot of recording with his brothers. They go on tour, and most of Michael Jackson's time is spent as a member of the Jackson 5. However, Michael always wanted to pursue a solo career, so he sometimes split his time, going solo and also working with his brothers. There was a lot of pressure for him to stay with his brothers because, as long as he and his brothers went on tour, the family made a lot of money. These tours would bring in millions of dollars, and the brothers would each make a couple million. The father would make a couple million, and Michael would make a couple million, although he could make a lot more if he goes solo. But he sort of divides his time, goes on tour with his brothers, and also releases some solo records. At 13 years old, he releases his first solo, which sells 1.5 million copies, a pretty good success. Rockin' Robin, his next single, reaches number 2 on the charts, and then he has his first number 1 single, song called Ben. If you remember Ben, but that was a movie about a rat that's a pet of a young man. Ben was the name of the rat, and the theme song for the movie wound up becoming number 1 in the charts. So Michael starts out as being very successful as a 13 and 14-year-old young man as a solo artist. The trouble is that after that, his career seems to go downhill. His next 6 records, including an album, just really didn't go anywhere. You can see from the number of sales, none of them reached 1 million copies of records sold. Some of them really did very poorly. So it seems like his career has sort of reached a standstill, and he's not enjoyed the success that he enjoyed when he went solo originally and when the Jackson 5 released their first 6 singles. But a breakthrough in Michael Jackson's career is when he's about 20 years old, 19 years old. He is recruited to star in a movie called The Wiz, a takeoff on The Wizard of Oz. If you remember, Diana Ross played Dorothy. Ted Ross, the gentleman on the left, played the Cowardly Lion. Nipsey Russell played the Tin Woodman, and Michael Jackson played the Scarecrow. The movie was a disaster commercially, but the reason why it was a breakthrough film for Michael Jackson was because that's where he met Quincy Jones. Quincy Jones arranged the film's musical score, and he became friends with Michael, and he agreed that after they completed the filming of The Wiz, that he would produce Michael Jackson's album called Off the Wall. So sure enough, after The Wiz is completed, they work together on Off the Wall, and it just becomes an incredible smash. It has 4 of the records from the album that are released as singles and reach the top 10 of the charts, sells over 20 million copies worldwide, and is just an incredible success. Michael Jackson thought he would win all sorts of Grammys for Off the Wall, but as it turns out, he only won 1 Grammy for Off the Wall. And he was determined that his next album was going to be even more successful than Off the Wall. So he and Quincy Jones collaborate a year later to produce the album Thriller. And Thriller becomes the best-selling album of all time. If you can believe that as of today, it has sold over 100 million copies worldwide. It was a #1 album on the charts for 37 weeks. And it had 7 of their records from the album released as singles and reached the top 10 on the charts for singles records. And as it turned out, his hope of having more Grammys for this album than for Off the Wall was met when he won 7 Grammys for Thriller in 1984. And he actually won 8 Grammys. His 8th Grammy was for the musical score for E.T. So he won a Grammy for the best album for a children's category. So he wins 8 Grammys in one night, and the Thriller is still the #1 album of all time in terms of success at the Grammys and number of records sold. There's one other album that Quincy Jones and Michael Jackson collaborated in, and that was Bad. That was released a few years later, 5 years between Thriller and Bad, but once again, an incredible success. 5 singles from that album reached #1 on the charts and sold 30 million copies worldwide. So those were the 3 albums on which Michael Jackson and Quincy Jones collaborated. Michael also would go on some concert tours after the release of some of these songs or albums to take advantage of the popularity of these songs. And here he went on a Bad World Tour, 123 concerts to an audience totaling over 4 million people, where he made millions of dollars on the proceeds from that long concert tour. But not everything was going well for Michael Jackson. In January 1984, he was filming a commercial for Pepsi at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles, and there were all sorts of pyrotechnics that were involved in this commercial. And as he's filming the commercial, a type of explosive goes off near his head, and his hair catches on fire. And I don't know if you can see from at least this particular picture that his hair is on fire. He's able to put out the fire, but it causes some serious burns to the top of his head. And when the autopsy was performed on Michael Jackson some years later, it was discovered that he still hadn't had the hair grow back where he had sustained these severe burns, and he always wore a toupee, a small toupee, just to cover the bald spot in the back of his head. But you can see just from this photograph, this angle, after the fire's put out, that he does have this severe burn near the top of his head, and the hair that's lost is never able to grow back. Anyway, he spends some time in the hospital for the second and third degree burns. Comes out of the hospital, resumes his career. He's presented an award by President Reagan for his charitable work. And one of the things that people start to notice was the changing face of Michael Jackson. Remember, he was born in 1958. This is Michael as a young man. One of the things he didn't like was the large bulbous nose he had. His father, Joseph, had this large nose, which apparently was a trait that he passed on to all of his sons. And Michael just did not like the large nose that he had. But you can see from the progression of these photos through the years that around 1986, between these two photographs, a change is very clear from Michael's photographs, that by 1988, he has had some work done on his nose, so it's much narrower. He also wanted a dimple added to his chin. And here, as he gets older, you can see that his face appears to have become much whiter. And just some pictures of Michael into the 21st century. The picture on the right was just a couple of months before he died, but you can see that besides the nose being much smaller, his face appeared to be much whiter. And many people speculated that he was changing the complexion of his face because he wanted really to be white. And he was undergoing some sort of treatments, it was believed, to try and appear to be a white person. But in reality, Michael suffered from a skin disorder called vitiligo. This, by the way, is not a picture of Michael Jackson. This is just an example of what vitiligo is. It results in a loss of pigmentation, which has these large blotches that are left on the individual's body. And so for treatments to vitiligo, Michael had to take some medication, a bleaching cream, and also would apply pancake makeup when he had to make some appearances to cover up the blotches that were apparent without the makeup. So he did look like he was very pale once he applied all this medication. He went to a skin doctor named Arnold Klein, who gave him these treatments, and Arnold Klein had a nurse named Debbie Rowe, who became very friendly with Michael Jackson. Neverland Valley Ranch. In 1988, Michael Jackson bought a huge parcel of land, 2,700 acres in Santa Barbara County. He paid $17 million for the property and changed it so that he had an amusement park that he installed on the park. This is an overhead view of the Neverland Ranch. Neverland Ranch was what he called it after he bought it, which I thought was a good name because he always felt he never had a childhood, having been, always practicing, going on tour, and never really doing the things that a young man his age would normally be doing. Sort of like Peter Pan, the person who never grew up. I guess that's how Michael felt that he was. But this is a view of the main building, main house of the Neverland Ranch. Michael Jackson had a bedroom which took up 2 floors of the main house. You can see that there's the amusement park with a merry-go-round, there's a Ferris wheel, there was a menagerie there with some animals, a zoo, a bird aviary, just all sorts of things that you would associate with an amusement park that he had installed at Neverland Ranch. And this is Michael with the amusement park in the background. Michael founded something called the Heal the World Foundation. Michael was always very concerned about young children, and the Heal the World Foundation contributed millions of dollars to children around the world who were affected by war, disease, or poverty. So, Michael Jackson certainly was someone who was generous with the money that he was making. In 1993, something happened which sort of changed Michael Jackson's life forever. He was accused that year of child abuse. What happened was there was a young man named Jordy Chandler, and one day Michael had problems with his car, went to a rent-a-car location to rent a car, and Jordy Chandler and his mother were there, and Jordy Chandler, the mother, June, goes up to Michael Jackson and says, "My son is a wonderful fan of yours. Here's our phone number. Why don't you call him?" So Michael accepts the piece of paper, the phone number, and he actually starts calling Jordy Chandler. And Jordy and his mother and the sister of Jordan are invited to the Neverland Ranch. There are these bungalows on the premises where persons who come to the ranch and take advantage of the amusement park can live in the bungalow if they want to stay overnight. But on several of the occasions where Jordan, his mother, and his sister went to the Neverland Ranch, while the mother and the sister were staying in the bungalow, he would go into the main house and stay in Michael Jackson's room overnight. And Michael Jackson became, especially friendly with the entire family, and would take them with him when he would go to various places to perform. He even took them to Monaco when he was performing there in 1993. Took him to Las Vegas. And invariably, when they went traveling together, June and the daughter would stay in one room, and Michael Jackson and Jordan would stay overnight in Michael's room. June, the mother of Jordan, was separated from Jordan's father, Evan. And Evan, when he heard about the fact that his son was staying in the same room overnight with Michael, got very concerned. And he had his son taken to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist examined Jordan, and Jordan told the psychiatrist about all these incidents of oral sex and masturbation that had taken place between himself and Michael Jackson. And in California, the law requires that if a psychiatrist learns about child abuse from interviewing a child, they must report that interview to the Department of Children's Services. So the psychiatrist who interviewed Jordan did that, and suddenly, the Department of Children's Services are involved. They contact the police, and soon there is an investigation of Michael Jackson regarding these allegations of abuse against Jordan Chandler. The police start an investigation which becomes publicized in the newspapers. And during this time, Michael Jackson is on tour, his Discovery tour, and he's very upset when he hears while he's on tour about the fact that his Neverland Ranch is being searched, that he's being investigated for these allegations of child abuse. And so he has to cancel the last month of the tour, returns to California and the Neverland Ranch, and is served with a search warrant. The search warrant is to take pictures of Michael Jackson's private parts. So he has to go through this horrible ordeal of having to stand naked in his living room at the Neverland Ranch while these strangers are taking pictures of himself and his private parts. And Michael Jackson later said that this was the most horrible and humiliating experience that he'd ever gone through. And he told his lawyers, get rid of this case. And so his lawyers did what very few people could do. They used their client's money to get rid of the case. I mentioned that Michael paid $17 million for the Neverland Ranch. Well, he paid $17 million to the Chandler family to settle a civil suit that the Chandler family had brought against them. And part of the terms of the settlement was a non-disclosure agreement. And so as a result of that, the Chandler family would no longer cooperate with the police in this criminal investigation of Michael Jackson. And the investigation was dropped. And there were no criminal charges that were ever filed in this particular case. Wives and children of Michael Jackson. Into his 30s, Michael Jackson had never been known to have a steady girlfriend. And he sometimes would be seen escorting some famous actresses to various events. Here's a picture of Michael with Liz Taylor in 1980. I think they were going to the Academy Awards. Another picture of Brooks Field and Michael Jackson going again to the next year's Academy Awards. And here's a picture of Michael with Madonna in 1991 going to the Academy Awards, arguably the #1 male and female music artists of all time. Lisa Marie Presley was the daughter of Elvis Presley, who you might consider to be, at least I consider to be, the second greatest male music star behind Michael Jackson. And in 1993, when Michael was in his mid-30s, he met Lisa Marie Presley, and she was trying to start her own singing career, and Michael agreed to help her. And so they often talked on the phone, and 1993 was when Michael was involved in these allegations involving Jordan Chandler, and he would often call Lisa Marie Presley, and she offered him a lot of emotional support during this difficult time in Michael's life. So after the criminal charges were dropped in the Jordan Chandler case, they began to see each other more and more, and wound up getting married in May 1994. They were divorced, separated and divorced within a year or two after they met. And Lisa Marie Presley often said that, Michael always wanted to be around children, and he really needed a mother more than he needed a wife. And Michael wanted to have children. But Lisa Marie had had 2 children by a prior marriage, and she did not want to have any children with Michael. And she told him that, and that was the basic reason why they got divorced. And Michael was pretty upset about the fact that he was not going to have any children. One of the things, by the way, that Lisa Marie used to claim was that they did have the normal sexual relations that a husband and a wife would have during a marriage. Debbie Rowe was the nurse in Arnold Klein's dermatology office, where Michael would go to have his skin condition treated. And they became very friendly over the years, and he would sometimes call Debbie Rowe rather than Arnold Klein when he had some problems, with his skin condition that was being treated. And after he separated from Lisa Marie Presley, he was pretty despondent and told Debbie Rowe that he was upset that he might never become a father. And so Debbie Rowe offered to bear his children. So here's just some pictures of Michael Jackson and Debbie Rowe. In the summer of 1996, Debbie Rowe gets pregnant, and while she's pregnant, they get married. They wanted to legitimize whatever child she was going to have born to her, and so Michael and she agreed that they would get married to legitimize the child. And sure enough, in February 1997, she has a son born in Los Angeles named Prince Michael Jackson. Prince, by the way, has probably got a double meaning. It probably shows what Michael felt about his first son, that he was a prince, but it was also as an old family name. Michael's grandfather and great-grandfather had both been called Prince. Debbie Rowe gets pregnant again and winds up having a second child called Paris Catherine Michael Jackson. Paris, because that's where Catherine and Michael claim that this daughter was conceived, when they were traveling on tour, and that's where the daughter was conceived, whether it was done through artificial insemination or through normal sexual relations, we don't know, but apparently it did take place in Paris. And Catherine, the middle name, of course, was Michael Jackson's mother's name, and then Michael Jackson. He liked to have Michael Jackson as part of the name of all his children. And after the two children were born, Michael and Debbie Rowe got divorced because there was no longer reason for them to stay married once they had the two children and they were legitimate because of the divorce. And Debbie Rowe gets a wonderful settlement. She gives up any claim to the children, is not going to be involved in raising them at all, but in exchange to giving Michael full custody over the children, she gets an $8 million settlement and a house in Beverly Hills. So she did all right for herself. And these are photographs sort of recently of Michael Jackson's three children. Mentioned the first two that were born by mother Debbie Rowe. A few years later, a third child showed up that Michael was the father of, and we still don't know where the child came from, who the mother was, or the circumstances of this child's birth. But the third child, Prince Michael Jackson II, was born in March of 2002, nicknamed Blanket. The story was that Michael was going to have all sorts of male sons, Prince Michael Jackson the first, second, third, as long as he kept having sons. But that was the third and last child that Michael would have. Michael was always involved in doing some bizarre things. And remember this photograph of Michael shortly after Blanket was born, dangling his son over a fourth-story balcony when he's in Berlin. But Michael, from all appearances, was really very much in love with his children. Michael's legal problems did not stop with the Jordan Chandler case. He had an even more serious run-in with the law in the year 2005 with a young man named Gavin Arvizo. Gavin Arvizo, when he was about 10 or 11 years old, had been diagnosed with cancer. He had a huge tumor, and surgery removed the tumor along with the spleen and a kidney, and everyone thought that this was a terminal disease. And they asked Gavin, what sort of wish do you want to have fulfilled? And he says, I'm a big fan of Michael Jackson's, and I'd like to visit Michael Jackson. So they make arrangements for Gavin to go to Neverland. He goes there a number of times in the year 2000. Most of the time in 2000, Michael was not at Neverland. He was on tour, but a couple of times when he was at Neverland, twice, Gavin would sleep overnight in Michael's bedroom. The year 2001, Michael did not see Gavin that year, but in 2002, when Gavin's cancer was in remission, he started to return to Neverland. And apparently Michael paid a lot of the medical bills for Gavin Arvizo, and probably that's one of the reasons why he was able to put this cancer in remission, because he was getting now suddenly the best medical treatment courtesy of Michael Jackson. So in 2002, Gavin Arvizo was once again spending some time at Neverland Ranch. I don't know if you've heard of a British journalist named Martin Bashir. He's got a show now on CNN, but in the... it is CNN, okay. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Okay, MSNBC, that's right, one of the shows. So he's got a show now in the States, but he was well known in the 90s for having filmed a documentary on Princess Diane, a very favorable documentary on her life, which was very popular in Great Britain. And Michael Jackson wanted to refurbish his image, so he invites Martin Bashir to come to Neverland over an 8-month period and just have free reign over, going over the Neverland Ranch talking to whatever people are there. And so Martin Bashir takes advantage of that. He does prepare a documentary called Living with Michael Jackson. The problem was that one of the people that Martin Bashir met on Neverland was Arvizo, Gavin Arvizo, and Gavin told him off camera about the fact that he would often spend the night in Michael's bedroom. And so as part of the documentary, Martin Bashir is interviewing Michael Jackson, and here is the interview which pertains to people sleeping overnight in his room. And Michael is very defensive, and instead of just sort of minimizing it, if you look at the last paragraph, he says, "But I have slept in a bed with many children." Suddenly he's saying that he's a serial person sleeping with all these kids, and that's what is played as part of the special. And of course, although the special has all sorts of nice things to say about Michael Jackson, everybody just remembers the part about him having spent the night with children in his room on many occasions. So the Santa Barbara Sheriff's gets involved. Once again, the father of Gavin Arvizo is concerned enough to have his son examined by psychiatrists, and Gavin Arvizo tells them about these situations involving oral sex and masturbation with Michael Jackson. They tell the Sheriff's Department about it, and suddenly Michael Jackson is being investigated by the Sheriff's Department. And he's arrested in November of 2003. This is his booking photograph. And he's actually charged in Santa Barbara with 9 counts, 7 counts of child molestation, and 2 counts of furnishing alcohol to the kids he would take into his bedroom to sort of break their defenses. At least that was the prosecution theory. Anyway, Michael Jackson eventually goes to trial. By now they have sort of changed the number of counts. They add a conspiracy count in addition to 5 counts of sexual molestation, lewd acts upon a child, and 4 counts of administering alcohol to a child to break down their defenses to commit child molestation. So these are the main individuals in this trial in San Bernardino County involving Michael Jackson. The prosecutor is Tom Snedden, who I went to law school with. Tom was the head of the Santa Barbara DA's office in 1993 when the allegations involving Jordan Chandler came up, and he was frustrated by the fact that cooperation ceased with the alleged victim in that case upon the large civil settlement. And he's still in charge of the DA's office in the period where this investigation is taking place, and he personally decides to handle the prosecution. Very unusual that the head of the prosecuting agency is going to handle the case. The judge, Rodney Melville, and the defense attorney, Thomas Messero, who had some other famous cases, including Robert Blake's case, but he's best known for his defense of Michael Jackson in this particular case. No cameras allowed in the courtroom, but these are some sketches of the events in the courtroom. Here's a courtroom sketch of Gavin Arvizo on the witness stand. The co-prosecutor, Ron Zonin, examining Janet Arvizo, the mother of Gavin Arvizo. Star Arvizo was Gavin's younger brother by a year, and he claimed he'd been in the room on a couple of occasions where he had observed Michael and Gavin, having mutual masturbation, oral sex, that sort of thing. So he was the corroborating witness. Michael still did some bizarre things during the trial. He always had the umbrella to protect himself from the sun. Here he's standing on a car, waving to his fans. One odd situation was when he showed up for court in his pajamas. Apparently he didn't feel good one morning, so he was taken to the hospital on the way to the courthouse, and in his haste to get to the courthouse, wasn't able to change into normal clothes and shows up dressed in his pajamas. Michael does not testify in his defense. He just relies on his lawyer to try and impeach the witnesses and create a reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. Here's Michael with his attorney, Thomas Misrow, the white-haired gentleman, and either members of the family. I think there's maybe a couple of security personnel included in this photograph. Anyway, this is just a little overview of the history of the criminal case against Michael. And the trial takes about 5 or 6 months. And on June 13th, 2005, Michael Jackson is found not guilty of all charges. And these are some of the people. Every day there were all sorts of Michael Jackson fans outside the courthouse. And this is a photograph of them celebrating the finding of not guilty. Okay, the death of Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson really didn't celebrate the fact that he was acquitted of these charges. By now he was a broken man, and he sort of went not into real seclusion, but just didn't face the public anymore after his acquittal. He lived in Las Vegas for a while with his kids and just kept a very quiet existence, just spending time with his family. Just to go into some of the background before we talk about his death, Michael Jackson had been very successful going on tour. He had gone on 3 tours during his life. All of them were incredibly successful, as you can see here. And after he'd been sort of out of the public eye for a while, he decided that maybe he was ready for one last tour called This Is It, because some of his records had been re-released. They were selling well, even though he himself was not performing. So he decides that he's going to have his goodbye tour called This Is It. He had celebrated his 50th birthday in 2008, and he was ready for this last tour called This Is It. And this is the press conference where he announces a series of concerts or shows in London. Originally, he was going to do 10 shows in London, but they sold out the same day the tickets were offered, so suddenly he agrees to do 50 concerts in London, which isn't as bad as traveling all over the world. At least he's going to stay in one location and do all these concerts. So he starts to rehearse. Most of the rehearsals take place at the Staples Center in Los Angeles, and apparently he's in great form. Most of his concerts were really major productions. They had terrific special effects. Michael Jackson was an amazing dancer in addition to singing these very popular songs. They had interesting costumes. I mean, they were really terrific shows for the fans and very popular. And he looks like he's in great form, preparing for his This Is It tour. In fact, there was a movie with rehearsal footage from This Is It that was released after he died. And I don't know if you saw it or not, but he looked like he was in terrific form for this upcoming concert tour. Conrad Murray was a doctor who was born in Grenada, but was educated in the United States, including going to medical school. And he wound up having medical offices in Las Vegas and California. While Michael Jackson was living in Las Vegas, he got to know Dr. Murray because he took some of his children to Dr. Murray for treatment. And Michael Jackson was concerned about his physical health when he was on tour. He wanted a doctor to make sure that he was strong enough and healthy enough to perform now this rigorous schedule of 50 concerts in London. So he assigns Dr. Murray to keep him healthy for the upcoming tour at $150,000 a month. And you can see that Dr. Murray did have some substantial debts that he was concerned about, and this $150,000 a month was certainly going to be helpful in resolving his financial problems. And part of the deal was that while Michael Jackson was rehearsing for the upcoming This Is It tour, that Dr. Murray would spend the evenings at his house to make sure that he was properly rested. So Michael Jackson died on June 25th, 2009. But the night before, he had gone to Staples Center to rehearse, came home after midnight, and wasn't able to sleep. Dr. Murray was there, gave him various medications, and Michael just still couldn't fall asleep. Finally, now it's about 10:30 or 10:45 in the morning of June 25th, and Michael is complaining that he can't sleep. So Dr. Murray gives him something called propofol. And we'll talk about propofol in a couple of minutes. After administering propofol to Michael Jackson, Dr. Murray goes into another room to make some telephone calls, call some of his old girlfriends, leaving Michael unattended by himself in his bedroom. And while he's on the phone talking to one of the girls, he just sort of peeks to see how Michael is doing, sees that Michael has stopped breathing. And so suddenly drops the phone, calls for help, the security comes, 911 is called, and the paramedics come to the location, but it's too late to save Michael Jackson. This is a transcript of the 911 call that was made by Albert Alvarez, one of the security people that was called by Dr. Murray. And, they give the address, that someone has stopped breathing. One of the things that Dr. Murray does wrong was he was trying to administer CPR to Michael Jackson. But to administer CPR, you've got to have a strong surface supporting the back of the individual you're doing the CPR to. And he was trying to perform CPR whereas Michael was still in the bed. And so the CPR wasn't just going to work, and the dispatcher is explaining you got to put him on the floor for the CPR. And no one really tells the dispatcher that it's Michael Jackson until the very end of the 911 call. They say, yes, we do have a doctor here, although it looks like the doctor is not of much help, that Michael's not responding to anything. In any event, the dispatcher says we're going to send someone over as soon as possible. We're less than a mile away. So Michael Jackson does die. He's never revived after he stopped breathing. A couple of days later, there was a memorial service at Staples Center. Over 30 million people watched it. That was televised, and there were all sorts of persons who paid tribute to Michael Jackson during this memorial service. But right away, the police started an investigation of Dr. Murray. They served a search warrant on his offices in Houston. That's the medical clinic in Houston. This is Michael Jackson's autopsy report. You can see that the autopsy report says that the cause of death was acute propofol intoxication. And it also lists some of the other things that were determined during the autopsy, that he did suffer from vitiligo, that skin disease that he had, as well as the toupee that they observed that he wore at the time that they performed the autopsy. And what is propofol? Propofol probably is the most popular anesthetic that is now being used by doctors during operations. I had some major surgery this summer, and before they put you under, you get to talk to your anesthesiologist, and I was saying that what anesthetic will you use? And they said, oh, propofol. And I said, well, you're going to stay in the room, aren't you? And he says, don't worry. Knowing that I didn't want them to pull a Michael Jackson on me. But propofol is considered to be, the best anesthetic now being used for surgery because there are virtually no after effects when you wake up. A lot of people are able to go home the same day of the surgery because of the lack of any after effects. And the one thing about propofol, though, is that it has to be used in a hospital setting. This, by the way, is an addendum to the autopsy report that was prepared after the autopsy of Michael Jackson. And the coroner thought it was very important to have something included in the autopsy report which talked about propofol and its effects. They said propofol is fine if it's used in a hospital setting. However, it should never be used away from a hospital because one of the side effects is that it can cause respiratory failure. and the heart can stop beating. But as long as you're being monitored, the hospital equipment will more than compensate for that sort of problem. And so here, they're saying that, first of all, it should not be used as a substitute for sleep. And secondly, it should never be used at home without being monitored the entire time that the individual is from the propofol administration. So it's a 2-page report, the second page of the propofol addendum. So the case winds up going to trial. This is a slide that sort of talks about the major players in the trial of Dr. Murray for the death of Michael Jackson. This is a picture of the judge, a very highly thought of judge, the DAs, the defense lawyers. The charges were just involuntary manslaughter, which is considered not to be a high-grade felony, but it has a maximum of 4 years in state prison. In California, the judge has a choice of 3 sentences to impose. Involuntary manslaughter can be 2, 3, or 4 years. If you're convicted, the judge having the choice of selecting one of those terms. And the trial took place in the criminal courts building in downtown Los Angeles. This is Dr. Murray in court with his key attorney, Edward Chernoff on the left, who was an attorney in Texas who came to Los Angeles to lead the defense, and Michael Flanagan, who was a Los Angeles-based lawyer, who was the co-chair in the defense of Dr. Murray. This is the DA who handled the case, Dave Waldron, a very capable deputy district attorney. There was a preliminary hearing, and this basically is a summary of the witnesses who testified at the preliminary hearing. Basically, they were security people who were inside the house when Dr. Murray was there and who responded, medical personnel that came from the 911 call, people at the hospital, police officers that interviewed Dr. Murray, and some of the people that Dr. Murray talked to on the phone. Well, he should have been watching Michael Jackson. He went out of the room to talk on his cell phone after giving Michael Jackson the propofol. So these were the list of witnesses that testified. So there is a trial set, and Michael's death. The judge feels that there's more than enough evidence to go to trial. A jury is selected in September 23rd, 5 women, 7 men. And this is just a list of the various people involved in the trial, the attorney, the judge, the defendant, and some of the key witnesses. I thought that Sade Anding was the key civilian witness for the prosecution. She was the ex-girlfriend of Dr. Murray that he was talking to on the phone at the time that he should have been monitoring Michael Jackson. And they're talking about half an hour, and suddenly he says, I'm going to check on Michael, and suddenly the phone goes dead. So she made it clear that instead of being with Michael as he should have been, that he was outside the room talking to her on a cell phone conversation. The people called an expert witness, Dr. Stephen Schaefer, who basically said that propofol is something you do not use in a home setting. It's got to be done in a hospital, and he was excellent in explaining the dangers of propofol outside the hospital. The defense expert was Dr. White, and Dr. White had to admit that it was improper to use propofol outside a hospital. But his defense was, well, maybe Michael Jackson self-administered the propofol while Dr. Murray was outside the room. A pretty weak defense, and as you can imagine, Dr. Murray is found guilty by the jury. Here he's taken into custody. He was out on $75,000 bail. And the judge, Michael Pastor, wound up giving Dr. Murray the maximum sentence of 4 years, which means it'll probably wind up doing 2, because in California, you get 1 day off for each day you serve, 1 day of credit. So the 4 years will probably mean that he'll get out after doing 2 years. Just a little epilogue, a couple of photographs of Michael's children, one with Michael as they're walking with their masks, and another one now of the children walking, I think, at one of the theme parks after the death of their father. And the concert film, This Is It, that was released after Michael's death, generated receipts of $280 million. Michael did have a will, and basically there's a trust that he set up for his 3 children, and he also gave a lot of money to his mother and to charity. Gave nothing to his father. In fact, his father's not even mentioned in the will, and gave nothing to his brothers or sisters, although it's suspected that the mother is going to give her share of what she's got in the hundreds of millions to her children upon her death. So that's the life and death of Michael Jackson, and thank you very much for attending.